There is a pair of statues in Luxor, two colossal figures of quartzite, each standing approximately 18 meters tall, each weighing an estimated 720 tons, a mass so great that the logistics of quarrying, transporting, and erecting them represent one of the most impressive engineering achievements of the ancient world, that have been sitting in the same spot, on the same patch of floodplain, on the west bank of the Nile, for more than 3,400 years. They are called the Colossi of Memnon, though they have nothing to do with the Greek hero Memnon and everything to do with the Egyptian pharaoh they depict, a man named Amenhotep III of that name, the ninth pharaoh of the 18th Dynasty, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1390 to 1353 BC. The statues show him seated on his throne, hands resting on his knees, face turned eastward toward the rising sun and the river and the living world on the far bank. At his feet, carved into the same stone, are smaller figures of his mother Mutemwia and his wife Tie, two queens, two generations of royal women, flanking the seated king in a gesture of familial devotion and dynastic continuity. The statues are the only things left of the building they once guarded. Behind them, in the space where the two colossi now stare at empty agricultural fields and the distant facades of modern Luxor, there was once a mortuary temple. It was the largest mortuary temple in the history of ancient Egypt, larger than the Temple of Karnak, larger than the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, larger than anything that any pharaoh before or after would build for the commemoration of his own divine afterlife. The temple covered an area of approximately 350,000 square meters, the equivalent of roughly 50 football fields, a single building complex so vast that it dwarfed every other structure in the Theban necropolis, and it was filled with hundreds of statues, dozens of columns, multiple courtyards, and a series of pylons that made the entrance alone more imposing than most complete temples elsewhere in the Nile Valley. The temple was decorated with inscriptions that listed the pharaoh's achievements, reliefs that depicted his divine connections to the gods, and sculptures of such size and beauty that later pharaohs would strip the site for materials, incorporating Amenhotep's stones into their own monuments like scavengers feeding on the carcass of a giant. The temple is gone. The Nile took it, annual floods, century after century, millennium after millennium, dissolving the mud brick walls, undermining the stone foundations, washing away the painted plaster and the carved reliefs until nothing remained but the two statues at the entrance, too massive and too heavy to move, too solid to dissolve, too monumental to be repurposed by even the most ambitious of the pharaoh's successors. The Colossi of Memnon are not merely statues. They are survivors, the last witnesses to a building that was, in its time, the most magnificent structure in the most magnificent civilization on Earth. A building so vast, so lavishly decorated, and so overwhelmingly impressive that the Egyptians themselves considered it the crowning achievement of 3,000 years of pharaonic building. The architects who designed the temple made a calculation about the colossi that reveals the mind behind the magnificence. The statues were carved from single blocks of quartzite, a stone that is considerably harder, significantly more resistant to erosion, and more enduring than the sandstone or limestone that most Egyptian monuments were made of. The quartzite had to be transported from the quarries near modern Cairo to the construction site at Thebes, a distance of approximately 700 kilometers, upstream against the current of the Nile. The logistics of moving two 720-ton blocks of stone that distance, on barges, on the river, against the current, through the narrowing valley of Upper Egypt, represent one of the most impressive and most logistically demanding feats of transport engineering in the ancient world. The effort was deliberate, calculated, and strategic. The pharaoh wanted these particular statues to last, wanted them to outlast the temple they guarded, wanted them to outlast the dynasty that built them, wanted them to outlast the civilization that conceived them. And in this at least, the calculation was correct. The two statues are not identical, though they appear so at first glance. Subtle differences in the carving, the proportions, and the treatment of the facial features suggest that they were produced by different workshops, or at different stages of the construction process. The smaller figures at the feet of the colossi, The representations of the queens who flanked the seated pharaoh are among the few surviving fragments of the mortuary temple's sculptural program, providing a tantalizing hint of the artistic quality that characterized the entire complex. The rest is gone, dissolved by the river, quarried by later pharaohs, broken up by centuries of neglect and opportunistic scavenging. The colossi endure because they were too big to move and too hard to break. And the man they depict, Amenhotep III, Nebmatra, the dazzling sun disk, was, by any measure, the most magnificent, the most culturally accomplished, and the most aesthetically ambitious pharaoh who ever lived. Not the most powerful. That title belongs to his great-grandfather, Thutmose III, the military genius who built the empire. Not the most famous. That title belongs to his grandson, Tutankhamun, whose tomb captivated the modern world. But the most magnificent, the pharaoh who took the wealth, the power, and the stability that his predecessors had accumulated over 4 generations of military conquest and diplomatic maneuvering and transformed them into something the ancient world had never seen and would never see again. A civilization of such extraordinary, almost unimaginable opulence, such refined artistic achievement, and such calculated splendor that the memory of it would echo across the millennia and define, for all subsequent generations, what it meant, what it truly, fully, completely meant, for a civilization to reach its absolute and unrepeatable peak. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand the reign of Amenhotep III, the pharaoh who never needed to fight a war, and who chose, with the strategic brilliance and the cultural vision of a man who understood the nature of power better than any of his military predecessors, with the strategic brilliance of a man who understood the nature of power better than any of his military predecessors. Because his great-grandfather had already won them all, the pharaoh who built more monuments than any Egyptian king before or after, the pharaoh who defied centuries of tradition by marrying a commoner named Ti and elevating her to a position of influence and authority that made her the most powerful, the most internationally recognized, and the most diplomatically consequential woman in the ancient world, and the pharaoh whose golden age produced the conditions, the extraordinary wealth, the unprecedented leisure, the dangerous theological experimentation that would lead, within a single generation, to the most radical religious revolution in the history of ancient Egypt and the near destruction of everything that Amenhotep had built. Akhenaten, the son who was given every advantage, every resource, every opportunity that the Golden Age could provide, would use those advantages to launch a theological revolution that closed the temples, dismissed the priests, relocated the capital, and replaced the entire religious framework of Egyptian civilization with a new, radical, and ultimately unsustainable vision that collapsed within a generation of its creation. The Golden Age produced the revolution, the magnificence funded the destruction, and the pharaoh who built the most opulent, the most artistically refined, and the most diplomatically sophisticated civilization the ancient world had ever seen was also, inadvertently and unknowingly, the man who created the conditions for its most traumatic and most destructive crisis. The story of Amenhotep III is not, therefore, merely a story of magnificence. It is a story of the relationship between magnificence and fragility, between the peak of a civilization and the conditions that make the peak unsustainable. It is a story of a man who built something extraordinary and who could not have known, could not have imagined, could not have foreseen that the very wealth, the very security, the very freedom from external threat that he had provided would give his son the resources and the opportunity to tear it all down. Akhenaten, the son who was given every advantage, every resource, every opportunity that the Golden Age could provide, would use those advantages to launch a theological revolution that closed the temples, dismissed the priests, relocated the capital, and replaced the entire religious framework of Egyptian civilization with a new, radical, and ultimately unsustainable vision that collapsed within a generation. The Golden Age produced the revolution. The magnificence funded the destruction, and the pharaoh who built the most beautiful civilization the ancient world had ever seen was also, inadvertently, the man who created the conditions for its most traumatic crisis. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin the story of the Golden Age. The story of Amenhotep III is not a story of conquest. It is not a story of battles won, or territories seized, or enemies defeated on the field of blood and bronze. It is a story of something rarer, something more fragile, and something infinitely more difficult to achieve. The transformation of military power into cultural magnificence, the conversion of imperial wealth into artistic transcendence, and the creation of a world so beautiful, so abundant, and so secure that the people who lived in it began to believe that it would last forever. It did not last forever. Nothing does. But the story of how it was built and of the man who built it is one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of human civilization. Amenhotep III was born into a world that had been made for him, though not by him, and not for the reasons that would come to define his reign. He was the son of Thutmose IV, a pharaoh who is remembered primarily for two things: the dream stela that he erected between the paws of the Great Sphinx at Giza, describing a divine encounter in which the Sphinx promised him the throne in exchange for clearing the sand that had buried its body up to the shoulders, and the diplomatic revolution that he completed with the kingdom of Mitanni, transforming Egypt's most dangerous enemy into its most valuable ally through a series of marriage alliances and diplomatic exchanges that ended a century of intermittent warfare. Thutmose IV was a competent ruler, but not a remarkable one. A pharaoh who maintained the empire that his grandfather Thutmose III had built, and his father Amenhotep II had defended, without adding significantly to either its territory or its institutions. Thutmose IV's reign, though relatively brief, perhaps 10 to 12 years, was nevertheless significant for the direction it set. The peace with Mitanni that he formalized through diplomatic marriage removed the military burden that had consumed the reigns of his father and grandfather, freeing Egyptian resources for domestic purposes and creating the essential conditions of international stability and diplomatic trust that would define and make possible the Golden Age. The young Amenhotep, watching from the Memphis court where he was raised, would have absorbed the lesson that his father's reign embodied, that the empire could be maintained through diplomacy as effectively as through war, and that the pharaoh's authority could be expressed through cultural and administrative achievement as powerfully as through military conquest. Thutmose IV died relatively young, probably in his 30s, leaving the throne to a son who was perhaps 6 to 12 years old, a child who, like his great-great-grandfather Thutmose III, who had ascended the throne as an infant under the dominance of Hatshepsut, came to power before he was old enough to rule independently, and who would need to be guided by regents and advisors during the earliest years of his reign. The child would grow into the most lavish, the most culturally ambitious, the most artistically sophisticated, and the most diplomatically accomplished pharaoh in the history of the 18th Dynasty. The young Amenhotep's mother was Mutemwia, a woman whose origins are debated, but who may have been of Mitanni royal blood, the daughter of a Mitanni princess who had been sent to Egypt as part of the diplomatic marriage alliances that had sealed the peace between the two kingdoms. If this identification is correct, and the evidence is circumstantial rather than conclusive, then Amenhotep III was himself a direct and traceable product of the diplomatic revolution that his father Thutmose IV and his grandfather Amenhotep II had laboriously and sometimes violently engineered, a child of two civilizations whose union was, in its own person, the embodiment of the remarkable and historically unprecedented international peace that would define his entire reign. Whether or not Mutemwia was of Mitanni descent, her son would grow up to be the most internationally connected, the most diplomatically engaged, and the most cosmopolitan pharaoh in the entire history of the Egyptian state. A ruler whose court was a crossroads of civilizations, whose harem included princesses from Mitanni, Babylon, Arzawa, and other kingdoms of the Near East, and whose diplomatic correspondence reveals a mind that was as comfortable navigating the complexities of international politics as the minds of the military commanders who had built the empire through warfare, a ruler whose correspondence with foreign kings, whose marriage alliances with foreign princesses, and whose diplomatic gifts to foreign courts would make his reign the high watermark of Bronze Age internationalism. What the young Amenhotep saw, what he grew up surrounded by, what he absorbed into the deepest levels of his consciousness before he was old enough to articulate it, was a civilization of extraordinary confidence. The confidence was not arrogance, it was the quiet, settled, empirically justified assurance of a state that had been the most powerful entity in the ancient world for 3 generations, and that had no reason to believe it would not continue to be so for 3 generations more. The temples were full, the granaries were stocked, the army was trained, the borders were secure, the tribute was flowing, the gods were pleased, the priests were performing the rituals, the Nile was rising and falling with its customary regularity. Everything worked, and the young prince, who would inherit this perfectly functioning system, needed only to keep it running, to maintain the machinery that his ancestors had built, to preserve the relationships they had established, and to spend the extraordinary wealth that the machinery generated in ways that honored the gods and demonstrated the pharaoh's divine magnificence and cultural supremacy to the entire known world. The Egypt that the young Amenhotep inherited was the wealthiest, the most politically stable, the most militarily powerful, and the most internationally connected and diplomatically sophisticated state in the ancient world. The empire that Thutmose III had built, stretching from the 5th cataract of the Nile to the banks of the Euphrates, was now in its 3rd generation of stable governance, and the tribute that flowed from the conquered and allied territories was filling the Egyptian treasury with a wealth that was, by the standards of the ancient world, almost incomprehensible in its volume and its variety. The temple storerooms at Karnak and Luxor overflowed with precious metals, imported timber, exotic stones, fine textiles, and the accumulated surplus of an empire that was systematically and efficiently extracting resources from conquered and allied territories stretching across 2 continents. The pharaoh's personal treasury, the wealth that was at the direct disposal of the crown, separate from the resources of the temples and the provincial administrations, was enormous, providing a financial foundation for the building program, the diplomatic gift exchanges, and the court life that would define the Golden Age. Gold poured in from the mines of Nubia, the Egyptian-controlled territory to the south that contained some of the richest, most productive, and most strategically important gold deposits in the entire ancient world. Silver, rarer than gold in Egypt and therefore more highly valued in certain contexts, came through trade with the Levantine coast and from the silver-producing regions of Anatolia. Copper came from the mines of the Sinai Peninsula and from the trade networks that connected Egypt to the copper-producing regions of Cyprus. Timber, the precious cedar of Lebanon that had been one of Egypt's most important imports since the Old Kingdom, arrived through the Phoenician port cities that had been incorporated into the Egyptian imperial system. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone that the Egyptians prized above almost all other materials, came from the distant mines of what is now Afghanistan, transported across thousands of kilometers of caravan routes that connected Central Asia to the Levantine coast, and from there to the Nile Valley. The accumulated wealth was staggering in its volume and its variety, and it was available in quantities that no previous pharaoh had enjoyed for whatever purposes the young king chose to direct it toward. The pharaoh's chief official, a man named Amenhotep, son of Hapu, one of the most famous administrators in the history of ancient Egypt, managed the enormous resources of the state with a competence that earned him a reputation that would endure for centuries. Amenhotep, son of Hapu, was not merely a bureaucrat. He was a genius of organization, a man who coordinated the enormous logistical operations involved in the quarrying, transport, carving, assembly, and decoration of the pharaoh's monumental building projects with an efficiency that made possible the most ambitious, the most expensive, and the most artistically accomplished construction program in the entire history of the ancient world. He was so profoundly revered by subsequent generations of Egyptians that he was eventually deified, elevated to the status of a god, worshipped as a god by later generations of Egyptians who recognized that the magnificence of Amenhotep III's reign was as much the product of administrative genius as of royal vision. Amenhotep, son of Hapu's career, illustrates a broader point about the Golden Age, that its achievements were not the product of a single individual, however gifted, but of a system that was capable of identifying, training, and deploying talent across every level of the administrative hierarchy. The pharaoh's vision would have remained a dream without the administrators who translated it into reality. The architects who designed the temples, the engineers who planned the transport of the quartzite blocks, the foremen who managed the work crews, the scribes who kept the records, and the officials who coordinated the complex supply chains that fed, housed, clothed, and equipped the thousands of workers who labored on the pharaoh's projects. The Golden Age was a collaborative achievement, the product of an entire civilization operating at its highest level of competence, not merely of a single ruler operating at the height of his ambition. The relationship between the pharaoh and his chief administrator was itself a testament to the sophistication of the Egyptian state during the Golden Age, a partnership between visionary royal ambition and meticulous administrative competence that produced results that neither could have achieved alone. The early years of Amenhotep's reign set the pattern that would define the next 4 decades. While previous pharaohs had spent their early years establishing military credentials, conducting military campaigns into the Levant or Nubia, suppressing rebellions among the vassal states, and demonstrating their martial worthiness on the actual battlefield, Amenhotep spent his early years hunting, building, and cultivating the international relationships that would sustain his reign. The lion hunt that he commemorated on his scarab, 102 lions killed during his first 10 years on the throne, was not merely a sporting achievement. It was a royal performance, a carefully staged demonstration of the pharaoh's courage, skill, and physical prowess that served the same essential political and theological function that military campaigns had served for his predecessors. The hunt was the pharaoh's substitute for war, a controlled, managed display of royal violence that satisfied the theological requirement for the pharaoh to confront and defeat the forces of chaos without requiring the enormous expense, the logistical complexity, and the strategic risk of a full-scale military campaign. The wild animals that the pharaoh hunted were understood, in the Egyptian theological framework, as embodiments of the chaotic forces that threatened the cosmic order, just as the foreign enemies that previous pharaohs had defeated on the battlefield were understood as manifestations of the same primordial chaos. By hunting lions and wild bulls, Amenhotep was performing the same cosmic function that Thutmose III had performed by conquering Megiddo, the defeat of chaos and the restoration of order, but in a context that was cheaper, safer, and more easily managed than a war. The economic infrastructure that sustained this wealth was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world. The Egyptian state under Amenhotep III was not merely a military power. It was an economic power, a trading power, a financial power whose gold reserves and whose control of key trade routes gave it a leverage over the international economy that no other state could match. The Egyptian treasury under Amenhotep was, in relative terms, the wealthiest in the ancient world, a fact that the Amarna letters confirm through the constant requests for gold that the other great kings directed to the pharaoh, and through the pharaoh's ability to respond to those requests with a generosity that, however occasionally stingy in the Babylonian king's view, was beyond the capacity of any other state to match. The scale of the gold production alone is staggering. Modern estimates suggest that the mines of Nubia produced several tons of gold per year during the height of the New Kingdom, a volume that made Egypt the Saudi Arabia of the ancient world, the one state whose extraordinary and apparently inexhaustible resource wealth gave it a permanent structural advantage in every diplomatic negotiation, every trade relationship, and every military calculation. The gold was not merely wealth, it was power. It was the instrument through which the pharaoh purchased loyalty, subsidized alliances, funded building programs, rewarded servants, and maintained the diplomatic relationships that sustained the international peace. The foreign kings who wrote to the pharaoh in the Amarna letters were not merely requesting gifts. They were requesting the essential commodity that sustained their own positions, funded their own building programs, and maintained their own diplomatic relationships with the other great powers. Gold was the blood of the international system, and Egypt, under Amenhotep III, controlled the supply. Amenhotep chose to direct this extraordinary wealth toward beauty, not war, not conquest, not the kind of military expansion that had defined his great-grandfather's reign, and that had been the traditional measure of pharaonic greatness since the wars of liberation against the Hyksos. Beauty, architecture, art, the creation of a built environment of such extraordinary splendor that it would serve as the most powerful statement of Egyptian supremacy that any pharaoh had ever made. A statement that said not, "We can destroy you, but we have surpassed you," in every conceivable dimension of human achievement, artistic, architectural, diplomatic, theological, and cultural, by a margin so vast that the comparison is no longer even meaningful. The decision was not merely aesthetic, it was strategic, a calculated determination that the Egyptian empire, having been built by military force, could be sustained by cultural force, and that the pharaoh's monuments, his temples, his palaces, and his artistic commissions could serve the same political function that his great-grandfather's campaigns had served: the projection of Egyptian power and the demonstration of Egyptian superiority on a scale that would make resistance seem not merely futile but absurd. Why would you rebel against a civilization that could design, finance, and construct the Temple of Luxor, a building whose beauty and whose scale exceeded anything that any other civilization in the ancient world could produce? Why would you challenge a kingdom whose pharaoh could commission 720 statues of the goddess Sekhmet, one for every day and night of the year, and install them in a single temple? Why would you defy a ruler whose palace at Malkata was so vast that it contained separate residences for the queen, the crown prince, and the king's harem, with painted ceilings, tiled floors, and an artificial harbour connected to the Nile by a canal that allowed the royal barge to sail directly from the river to the palace doorstep? The Birket Habu, the artificial harbour at Malkata, was itself a feat of hydraulic engineering that demonstrated the extraordinary technical capabilities of the Egyptian state. The harbour was large enough to accommodate multiple vessels, and its construction required the excavation of hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of earth, a project that demanded the mobilization of a labor force comparable to that required for the construction of a pyramid. The harbour was not merely functional, it was ceremonial, a setting for the processions, the festivals, and the royal progresses that formed a central part of Amenhotep's public life. The answer, as the vassal states and the great powers of the Near East understood, was that you would not. The magnificence was the message, the beauty was the weapon, and the pharaoh who wielded it was not a dreamer or an este. He was one of the most shrewd, most calculating, and most politically sophisticated rulers in the history of the ancient world. One of the most revealing aspects of Amenhotep's character, and one that sets him apart from every other pharaoh in the 18th dynasty, is his choice of a wife. Early in his reign, probably in his first or second year on the throne, Amenhotep married a woman named Tiye. Tiye was not a princess. She was not of royal blood. She was not the daughter of a king or the granddaughter of a queen. She was the daughter of a man named Yuya and a woman named Thuya, provincial notables from the city of Akhmim in Upper Egypt, people of some local prominence, but of no royal lineage whatsoever. The marriage was, by the standards of the Egyptian royal tradition, unprecedented. Pharaohs married princesses, daughters of kings, daughters of allies, daughters of the divine bloodline that the pharaonic theology required as the foundation of legitimate succession. They did not marry commoners, women of non-royal origin, women whose blood did not carry the divine spark that the pharaonic theology associated with the royal lineage. The decision to make Tai his great royal wife, the principal queen, the mother of the heir, the woman who would appear alongside the pharaoh on official monuments and in diplomatic correspondence, was a deliberate, bold, and politically calculated break with centuries of established tradition that announced, from the very beginning of the reign, that Amenhotep III intended to do things differently. And Tai was not merely a wife. She was a partner, a co-ruler in all but title, a woman whose influence on Egyptian domestic and foreign policy was so significant that foreign kings addressed their diplomatic correspondence not just to the pharaoh but to the queen as well. The Amarna letters, the extraordinary archive of cuneiform diplomatic correspondence discovered at the abandoned capital of Akhenaten in 1887, contain letters from foreign rulers addressed specifically to Ta, seeking her intervention in diplomatic disputes and acknowledging her authority in terms that suggest she was recognized by the international community as a figure of genuine political power. No other queen in the history of the 18th Dynasty, not even the formidable Hatshepsut, who had made herself pharaoh, had commanded this kind of international recognition. Ta was something new, a queen whose power derived not from the accident of her bloodline, but from the quality of her ability and the force of her character, not from her divine credentials, but from her political intelligence, not from the accident of birth, but from the deliberate choice of a pharaoh who valued competence over pedigree. Amenhotep III also innovated in the theological dimension of pharaonic self-presentation. At the Luxor Temple, he commissioned a series of relief sculptures depicting his divine birth, a theological narrative in which the god Amun visits the pharaoh's mother Mutemuia, the form of her husband Thutmose IV, and conceives the future pharaoh in a divine act that establishes the child's status as the literal son of the supreme god. The divine birth narrative was not entirely new. Hatshepsut had used a similar motif at her temple at Deir el-Bahari, but Amenhotep's version was more elaborate, more detailed, and more theologically ambitious, presenting the pharaoh's divine parentage not merely as a mythological convention, but as a historical event, a real occurrence that explained and justified the pharaoh's extraordinary power and extraordinary achievements. The divine birth reliefs at Luxor are among the most important theological documents of the New Kingdom, a visual argument for the divine nature of the pharaoh that would influence Egyptian royal theology for centuries, and that would be adopted in modified form by later pharaohs who sought to establish their own divine credentials through the same narrative framework. The marriage to Ta produced several children, including the son who would eventually succeed Amenhotep on the throne, a boy originally named Amenhotep, who would later change his name to Akhenaten, and who would, in the space of a single reign, dismantle the religious, political, and artistic traditions that his father had brought to their highest expression and replace them with something entirely new, entirely radical, and entirely destructive. But that is a story for another time. For now, the relevant point is that the dynasty that Amenhotep and Ta founded, the dynasty that would produce Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun, three of the most famous, the most discussed, and the most artistically celebrated figures in the entire history of ancient Egyptian civilization, began with a love match, or at least with a politically unconventional marriage that placed a commoner on the throne of the most powerful civilization on Earth. Amenhotep even issued commemorative scarabs, large carved beetles that served as a form of official announcement, proclaiming the marriage in terms that emphasized, rather than concealed, Taya's non-royal origins. The scarabs gave the names of Ti's parents, Yuya and Thuya, and identified her as the great royal wife, with a directness and a pride that was, in the context of Egyptian royal protocol, almost provocative. The pharaoh was not merely marrying a commoner, he was announcing the marriage, publicizing it, making it a centerpiece of his public image. The message was clear. This pharaoh chose his queen not for her bloodline but for her qualities, and the choosing was itself an assertion of royal authority, a statement that the pharaoh's personal will and personal judgment were the ultimate sources of legitimacy in the Egyptian state, and that tradition, however ancient, was subordinate to the pharaoh's judgment. The implications of the marriage for Egyptian social and political history are profound. If a commoner could become the great royal wife, the most powerful woman in the Egyptian state, the mother of the heir to the throne, the woman whose image appeared alongside the pharaohs on official monuments. Then, the traditional barriers between the royal family and the Egyptian aristocracy were not as rigid as they had seemed. The marriage suggested a new model of pharaonic authority, one in which the pharaoh's personal choice, rather than dynastic convention, was the ultimate source of legitimacy, and in which the qualities of the individual, rather than the status of the family, determined who was worthy of the highest positions in the Egyptian state. Tai's elevation to the position of great royal wife was not merely a romantic gesture. It was a political act, a statement about the nature of pharaonic power that had implications for the entire structure of the Egyptian court, and that would influence the political culture of the 18th dynasty for the remainder of its existence. The discovery of Yuya and Thuya's tomb in the Valley of the Kings in 1905 by the American excavator Theodore Davis was one of the most spectacular and most well-preserved archaeological finds of the early 20th century, a discovery that transformed scholars' understanding of the material culture of the Golden Age. The tomb, though not royal, contained one of the most complete, the best preserved, and the most artistically distinguished assemblages of funerary equipment ever discovered in the Valley of the Kings. An assemblage that provided modern scholars with an unprecedented window into the material culture, the artistic standards, and the funerary practices of the Amenhotep III era. Gilded coffins, elaborate furniture, jewelry, and personal objects that testified to the extraordinary status that Ti's parents had achieved through their daughter's marriage to the pharaoh. The preservation of the objects was remarkable. The gilded masks, the painted coffins, the carved chairs and beds had survived more than 3,000 years in conditions that allowed modern scholars to study them in extraordinary detail. The tomb of Yuya and Thuya was, until the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the most intact burial ever found in the Valley of the Kings, and its discovery provided a vivid glimpse of the wealth and the taste of the Amenhotep III era, the golden age that produced, in its workshops, its studios, and its royal ateliers, artifacts, furnishings, and decorative objects of such beauty and such refinement that they remain among the finest examples of Egyptian decorative arts in the world's museums. The central paradox of Amenhotep III's reign is that the most magnificent pharaoh in Egyptian history was also, in military terms, the least active. His great-grandfather, Thutmose III, had conducted 17 campaigns over 20 years. His grandfather, Amenhotep II, had conducted 3 campaigns in 9 years, brutal, theatrical expeditions that had crushed rebellion and terrorized the vassal states into submission. His father, Thutmose IV, had conducted at least 1 campaign in Nubia, and had managed the diplomatic transition from warfare to alliance with Mitanni. Amenhotep III conducted essentially no military campaigns at all. The single exception, a minor expedition to Nubia in the 5th year of his reign, directed against a territory called Akuyata, was so modest in scale and so limited in scope that it barely registers as a military operation by the standards of the 18th Dynasty. The campaign was so minor that some scholars have questioned whether it should be classified as a military campaign at all. It may have been a police action, a border enforcement operation, or even a ceremonial military exercise conducted for propaganda purposes rather than for genuine strategic objectives. The campaign appears to have been a punitive expedition against a local disturbance rather than a war of conquest or a strategic operation against a major enemy. The inscriptions that record the campaign give it less attention than a shopping list. No great battles were fought. No enemy armies were defeated. No territories were added to the empire. The expedition was, by the standards of the pharaohs who had preceded Amenhotep on the throne, the military equivalent of nothing, a footnote in a chapter that, under previous pharaohs, would have been filled with the epic narratives of siege, conquest, and the dramatic confrontation of armies on the field of battle. The absence of military campaigns is the single most important fact about Amenhotep III's reign and the single most misunderstood. Later generations of historians, shaped by the military values that defined pharaonic greatness in the traditional Egyptian understanding, have sometimes interpreted the absence of campaigns as evidence of weakness, of a pharaoh who was too comfortable, too indolent, too pleasure-loving, too absorbed in the delights of his palace and his harem to fulfill the martial obligations of his office. The interpretation is wrong. The absence of campaigns was not a failure, it was a strategy. It was the deliberate, fully conscious, politically and strategically calculated decision of a ruler who understood that the empire's fundamental security, its territorial integrity, its diplomatic relationships, its economic prosperity, was no longer dependent on the costly, disruptive, and logistically demanding annual military expeditions, and who chose, with the confidence and the clear-sightedness of a genuinely great statesman, to redirect the enormous resources that campaigns consumed toward purposes that served the empire's interests more effectively and more efficiently than warfare. And yet, and this is the paradox that lies at the heart of Amenhotep's reign, the empire did not collapse, the borders did not contract, the vassal states did not rebel, the tribute continued to flow, the great powers continued to treat Egypt as the supreme authority in the Near East. The diplomatic system that Thutmose III had created and that Amenhotep II had maintained through violence, and Thutmose IV had sustained through marriage alliances, continued to function smoothly, reliably, and without interruption, under a pharaoh who never led an army into battle in any meaningful sense, who never personally commanded a military force in a combat engagement against a significant enemy, who never experienced the terror and the exhilaration of chariot warfare, who never besieged a city, who never captured a prisoner, and who never hung a body on a wall. But here is the problem, and it is a problem that Amenhotep himself appears to have recognized, and that the magnificence of his building program was, in part, designed to address. An empire that is not defended is an empire that is assumed to be weak. A pharaoh who does not fight is a pharaoh who is assumed to be incapable of fighting. The military tradition of the 18th Dynasty, the tradition that defined the pharaoh as a warrior king, whose duty was to smite the enemies of Egypt and to maintain the cosmic order through the exercise of divine force, was not merely a convention. It was a theological requirement, a fundamental element of the pharaonic identity that connected the living king to the gods, that justified his authority, and that legitimized his position as the intermediary between the divine and human worlds. A pharaoh who did not fight was, in the strictest theological interpretation, a pharaoh who was not fulfilling his divine mandate, a pharaoh who was, in the theological language of the Egyptian state, failing in the most fundamental duty that the gods had assigned the holder of the double crown. The pharaoh was supposed to be the champion of Ma'at, the cosmic order that sustained the universe, and the defender of Egypt against the dark, primordial forces of chaos that constantly and relentlessly threatened to overwhelm it. The forces of chaos were understood to be both metaphysical and physical. They included the demons and monsters of the underworld, but they also included the foreign enemies who threatened Egypt's borders and the domestic rebels who challenged the pharaoh's authority. A pharaoh who did not campaign against these enemies was a pharaoh who was allowing the forces of chaos to advance unchecked, a dangerous condition that could, in the theological framework, lead to cosmic as well as political catastrophe. A pharaoh whose claim to the throne was, however marginally, weakened by his failure to perform the martial function that the gods had assigned to him. Amenhotep's response to this problem was one of the most brilliant and most consequential acts of political redefinition in the history of the ancient world. A redefinition that transformed the fundamental meaning and the essential nature of pharaonic power from the capacity to destroy into the capacity to create and to beautify, from the narrow ability to conquer and destroy into the broader and more demanding ability to inspire and to astonish, from the demonstration of military force into the demonstration of cultural supremacy. The strategy had a theological dimension as well. The pharaoh's duty to maintain Ma'at, cosmic order, could be fulfilled not only through the defeat of external enemies, but through the construction of temples, the commissioning of religious art, and the performance of the rituals and festivals that renewed the pharaoh's divine power and sustained the cosmic order through acts of worship rather than acts of war. Building a temple was, in the Egyptian theological framework as valid a fulfillment of the pharaoh's divine mandate as leading an army, perhaps more valid, since the temple served the gods directly, while the military campaign served them only indirectly, through the protection of the land that the gods had entrusted to the pharaoh's care. Amenhotep's vast and unprecedented building program was not merely a convenient substitute for military activity, a way to keep the labor force occupied and the treasury flowing. It was, in the theological register, that the Egyptians understood as fundamental, a superior form of royal service, a demonstration of divine piety that exceeded the military achievements of his predecessors in the directness and the purity of its devotion. The theological argument for building over warfare was reinforced by the practical reality that the empire's security was no longer dependent on annual military campaigns. The peace with the kingdom of Mitanni, formalized through the marriage alliances that Amenhotep's father, Thutmose IV, had initiated, and that Amenhotep himself had deepened and consolidated, had eliminated the most dangerous external threat to Egyptian security, the vassal system in the Levant, maintained by the garrisons, the tribute networks, and the diplomatic relationships that Thutmose III had created, was functioning effectively without the annual campaign cycle that Thutmose had maintained. The Nubian provinces were quiet, secured by the fortresses and the administrative infrastructure that had been built and maintained over generations of Egyptian control. There was, in the practical military assessment, no enemy to fight. There was no rebellion to suppress. There was no territory to conquer. The empire was complete, the borders were secure, and the international relationships were stable. Under these conditions, the building program was not merely a substitute for war. It was the appropriate response to a situation in which war was unnecessary, a response that used the enormous surplus of wealth and labor that the peace had made available for purposes that enriched the civilization, honored the gods, and demonstrated the pharaoh's magnificence to the world. He did not fight wars. Instead, he fought with gold, he fought with buildings, he fought with beauty. He fought with the overwhelming, irresistible, psychologically devastating display of wealth and power that his building program represented. A display so vast, so comprehensive, and so artistically accomplished that it served the same essential political, theological, and psychological function as a full-scale military campaign. The demonstration of Egyptian supremacy to every foreign ambassador who visited Thebes and walked through the temple of Luxor with his mouth open, the projection of pharaonic power to every vassal ruler who received a diplomatic gift of Egyptian craftsmanship, and understood that the civilization capable of producing such objects of such beauty, such refinement, and such technical sophistication, was not one to be challenged, defied, or treated with anything less than the deepest respect and the most complete submission, and the intimidation of anyone, vassal ruler, rival king, or domestic critic, who might question the pharaoh's authority. The building program of Amenhotep III was the largest and most ambitious in the history of ancient Egypt, larger than the building programs of Ramesses II, who is traditionally credited as Egypt's greatest builder, and larger than those of any other pharaoh of the New Kingdom, and among the largest in the entire 3,000-year history of the pharaonic state. The projects were spread across the entire territory of the Egyptian Empire, from the delta in the north to the deepest and most distant reaches of Egyptian-controlled Nubia in the south, a territory that stretched for more than 1,000 kilometers along the Nile, and that was administered by the pharaoh's viceroy, the official known as the King's Son of Cush. In Thebes alone, Amenhotep was responsible for the mortuary temple with the Colossi of Memnon, the Temple of Luxor, the palace at Malkata, additions to the Temple of Karnak, including the third pylon and a new entrance that redefined the approach to the sacred precinct, and numerous smaller structures whose remains have been identified in the archaeological record through foundation deposits, fragmentary inscriptions, and reused building materials that later pharaohs incorporated into their own constructions. At Soleb in Nubia, more than 500 kilometers south of Thebes, Amenhotep built one of the finest temples of the 18th Dynasty, a structure whose elegance and sophistication demonstrate that the pharaoh's artistic standards were maintained even in the most distant provinces of the empire. At Elephantine, at Memphis, at Hermopolis, at sites across the Nile Valley, the evidence of Amenhotep's building program is everywhere, a physical imprint on the landscape that was, in its totality, the single most comprehensive and most visually dramatic transformation of the Egyptian built environment that any single ruler had ever achieved. The numbers are striking, and they are worth pausing over because the scale of the construction tells us as much about the pharaoh's political strategy as any diplomatic letter or military inscription. The mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile, the temple that the Colossi of Memnon once guarded, covered 350,000 square meters. It was the largest religious building in the history of ancient Egypt. The Temple of Luxor, which Amenhotep built on the east bank of the Nile, dedicated to the god Amun-Re and designed as a setting for the great annual Opet festival, one of the most important religious ceremonies in the Egyptian calendar, in which the pharaoh's divine power was ritually renewed and his sacred connection to the god Amun was publicly reaffirmed through ceremonies of extraordinary theological and political significance, was one of the most beautiful, the most architecturally harmonious, and the most aesthetically refined buildings in the entire ancient world, with a colonnaded court whose towering papyrus bud columns created an effect of ordered majesty that visitors from every nation and every era still experience and still marvel at today, more than 34 centuries after the last stone was placed and the last wall was painted. The Luxor temple was not merely a building, it was a theological argument made architectural, a physical statement about the relationship between the pharaoh and the gods that was expressed not in words but in stone, in space, in the carefully calculated proportions and the deliberately overwhelming scale of the structure. The colonnaded court, with its rows of towering papyrus bud columns, each carved from a single block of sandstone, each standing more than 15 meters tall, was designed to create the impression of a sacred forest, a petrified grove of papyrus plants that evoked the primordial marshes from which the Egyptian creation myths said the world had emerged. The visitor who walked through the colonnaded court was not merely entering a building, he was entering a theological landscape, a constructed world that recreated, in stone and space, the conditions of the first creation, and that placed the pharaoh at the center of that creation, the divine mediator between the ordered world of the temple and the chaotic world beyond its walls. The palace at Malkata, built on the west bank as the pharaoh's primary residence, was the largest royal palace in the history of Egypt, a sprawling complex that included the king's own residential quarters and reception rooms, a separate and lavishly appointed palace for Queen Ti, apartments for the crown prince, audience halls, workshops, kitchens, storerooms, a temple to Amun, and an artificial harbour, the Birket Habu, that was connected to the Nile by a canal, and that served as both a ceremonial waterway and a practical transport link between the palace and the river. The palace at Malkata was not merely a residence, it was a political statement, a physical, tangible, sensory demonstration of the pharaoh's unprecedented wealth, his refined artistic taste, and his absolute political power that was designed to impress every visitor, every ambassador, every vassal ruler, and every foreign dignitary who entered its gates. The walls were decorated with painted scenes of wildlife, flowers, reeds, birds, fish, and animals in the marshes, rendered with a naturalistic attention to detail that was unprecedented in Egyptian palace decoration. The massive supporting columns were carved and painted to resemble papyrus plants and lotus blossoms, creating an interior that evoked the lush, fertile landscape of the Nile Valley. The ceilings were painted with geometric patterns and rosettes that mimicked the textiles and tapestries that adorned the rooms of the wealthiest households in the ancient world. The floors were tiled. The furniture was inlaid with gold, ivory, and precious stones. The cumulative effect on the senses, on the emotions, on the political and diplomatic calculations of every visitor was one of overwhelming, almost oppressive luxury, a luxury that was not merely decorative but deeply and deliberately political, not merely beautiful but carefully and strategically calculated, not merely magnificent but deliberately, calculatedly, relentlessly, oppressively impressive, designed to overwhelm the visitor's capacity for comparison and to establish, beyond any possibility of doubt, that the civilization capable of producing such luxury was so far beyond the reach of any rival that the very concept of rivalry was rendered meaningless. The diplomatic function of the palace was as important as its residential function. Foreign ambassadors who visited the pharaoh's court at Malkata would have been led through the painted corridors, past the lily columns and the wildlife murals, into the audience hall where the pharaoh sat on his gilded throne, surrounded by the symbols of his divine authority. The experience was designed to overwhelm, to impress upon the visitor, through the medium of sensory experience rather than verbal argument, the absolute superiority of Egyptian civilization, and the futility of any attempt to challenge, compete with, or resist the power that could produce such a setting. The palace was, in this sense, a diplomatic weapon, a physical argument for Egyptian supremacy that was more eloquent than any inscription and more persuasive than any military demonstration. And it gets worse, or rather, it gets more extraordinary, because the building program was not limited to Thebes. Amenhotep built temples across the entire empire, from Nubia in the south, where the temple at Soleb remains one of the finest examples of New Kingdom architecture outside Egypt proper, to the delta in the north, where his building projects have been less well preserved, but are attested in the archaeological record. He commissioned 720 statues of the goddess Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and pestilence, whose cult Amenhotep appears to have patronized with a special devotion, and installed them in his mortuary temple, creating a forest of stone deities that would have filled the temple courts with an army of divine guardians whose stone faces stared at every visitor who entered the sacred precinct. The Sekhmet statues are one of the most enigmatic elements of Amenhotep's building program and one of the most debated. Why 720? Why Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and pestilence, a deity whose associations were violent and destructive rather than peaceful and beneficent? Some scholars have suggested that the statues served an apotropaic function, that they were intended to ward off disease and pestilence, protecting the pharaoh, his court, his family, and his entire kingdom from the epidemics and the plagues that periodically devastated the ancient world. Others have suggested a more specifically theological purpose, that the two statues for each day of the year were intended to ensure that the goddess's protective power was continuously available, day and night, throughout the annual cycle. Whatever the purpose, the scale of the commission was staggering. No other pharaoh in Egyptian history had ever produced so many statues of a single deity, and the investment in labor, material, and artistic skill that the project required was enormous even by the standards of Amenhotep's lavish reign. The sheer number of Sekhmet statues, 2 for every day of the Egyptian year, 1 for the day and 1 for the night, is staggering. No other pharaoh in Egyptian history commissioned so many statues of a single deity. The investment of resources, the quarrying of the stone, the carving of the figures, the transport of the completed statues to the temple site, the installation and decoration was enormous, and it was only one element of a building program that was, in its totality, the largest single construction project in the history of the ancient world. The scale of the building program is difficult to comprehend from the perspective of the modern world, where construction is mechanized and materials are manufactured in factories. In the 14th century BC, every block of stone was quarried by hand, every column was carved by hand, every relief sculpture was chiseled by hand, every wall was painted by hand, every statue was shaped by hand. From the 720-ton colossi at the entrance of the mortuary temple to the 720 Sekhmet statues that filled its courts, the labor force that sustained this effort, the quarrymen, the stonemasons, the sculptors, the painters, the engineers, the architects, the transport workers, the cooks and bakers and brewers who fed them, numbered in the tens of thousands. The organizational challenge of coordinating this labor force, of ensuring that the right materials arrived at the right site at the right time, that the workers were fed and housed and managed, that the architectural plans were followed and the quality standards were maintained. was as impressive as the monuments themselves. The administration of the building program was, in its own way, as great an achievement as the buildings it produced. A triumph of organizational intelligence that demonstrated the extraordinary capacity of the Egyptian state during the Golden Age, a capacity that had been built up over centuries of institutional learning, and that was, under Amenhotep, deployed on a scale that had never been attempted before, and that would never be matched again. The workers who built Amenhotep's monuments were not slaves. They were skilled craftsmen, organized into teams and guilds, paid in rations of bread, beer, grain, and other necessities, and managed by a hierarchy of foremen, supervisors, and administrators who reported to the pharaoh's chief official, the legendary Amenhotep, son of Hapu, whose administrative genius was the indispensable complement to the pharaoh's creative vision. The labor system was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, a managed economy in which the state directed the allocation of human resources with a precision and an efficiency that modern project managers would recognize and admire. The craftsmen who carved the Sekhmet statues, who painted the walls of Malkata, who sculpted the Colossi of Memnon, were not anonymous laborers. They were artists, specialists who had undergone years of training and who possessed skills that were passed down through family lineages and guild traditions. Their work was the physical expression of the Golden Age, the translation of the pharaoh's grand architectural and theological vision into enduring stone, vivid paint, gleaming gold, and luminous glass. The diplomatic system that Amenhotep III managed was the most sophisticated and the most complex in the ancient world. A web of relationships, alliances, marriages, and gift exchanges that connected the Egyptian court to every major power in the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean, and that sustained an unprecedented period of international peace and prosperity that historians now call the Late Bronze Age International System, or, more evocatively, the Club of Great Powers. The system was built on a foundation of mutual recognition. The great kings of the era addressed each other as brothers, a term that implied equality of status and mutual respect, and that was sharply distinguished from the language used to address vassal rulers, who were addressed as servants, and whose subordination to the pharaoh was absolute and non-negotiable. The distinction between brothers and servants was the fundamental organizing principle of the Late Bronze Age international system, a distinction that determined the form of the correspondence, the nature of the gift exchanges, the terms of the marriages, and the obligations that each party owed to the others. The great kings, the Pharaoh of Egypt, the king of Babylon, the king of Mitanni, the king of the Hittites, the great Anatolian power that was emerging as a major force in the Near East, and that would, within a century of Amenhotep's death, become Egypt's most dangerous rival, and a few others, constituted an exclusive club whose membership was determined by power, wealth, and international recognition. The small states, the Levantine city-states, the Canaanite principalities, the client kingdoms of Syria and Palestine, were subordinate to the great powers and communicated with them in the language of submission and obedience. The system was hierarchical, pragmatic, and remarkably effective. It sustained a period of relative peace and prosperity across the ancient Near East that lasted for more than a century, and that was, in many respects, the most successful period of international cooperation in the pre-modern world. The mechanics of the system were complex and fascinating. The diplomatic correspondence was conducted in Akkadian, a Semitic language that none of the great powers used as its native tongue, but that all of them accepted as the common language of international communication. The letters were written on clay tablets in cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing system that had originated in Mesopotamia and that had spread, through trade and diplomacy, across the entire Near East. The fact that the Egyptian court, whose own scribes wrote in hieroglyphs and hieratic on papyrus, maintained a staff of Akkadian-speaking cuneiform scribes, demonstrates the sophistication of Egyptian diplomatic establishment and the seriousness with which the pharaoh's government approached its international responsibilities. The cuneiform scribes at the Egyptian court were specialists, trained in the Akkadian language expert in the conventions of international diplomatic correspondence, and familiar with the protocols, the formulas, and the subtle nuances of tone that distinguished a friendly letter from a threatening one, a generous offer from a grudging concession, and a genuine invitation from a diplomatic trap. The gift exchange system that sustained the diplomatic relationships was itself a complex economic operation, a carefully managed flow of luxury goods that served simultaneously as a display of generosity, a demonstration of wealth, and a mechanism for the transfer of strategic resources between the great powers. The gifts were not random. They were carefully selected to reflect the resources and the specialties of the sending kingdom, and the needs and the preferences of the receiving kingdom. Egypt sent gold, always gold, the commodity that every foreign king wanted, and that only Egypt could provide in sufficient quantities. In return, Egypt received horses from Babylon and Mitanni. The best-bred horses in the ancient world came from the Mesopotamian kingdoms. Copper from Al-Ashiyar, modern Cyprus. Lapis lazuli from the trade networks that connected Central Asia to the Mediterranean, and a vast array of luxury goods. Textiles, furniture, decorated weapons, carved ivory, perfumes, and medicinal preparations that enriched the Egyptian court, and that demonstrated, through the quality of their craftsmanship and the rarity of their materials, the cultural achievements and the economic resources of the kingdoms that sent them. The exchanges were meticulously recorded. The Amarna letters preserved detailed lists of the gifts sent and received, including the quantities, the materials, the types of objects, and the ceremonial context in which they were presented, providing modern historians with an unparalleled picture of the material culture and the economic relationships of the Late Bronze Age. The gift exchange was not merely economic, it was theatrical. The presentation of gifts at the Egyptian court was a public event, a ceremony attended by the court, the diplomatic corps, and the officials of the Egyptian state, and designed to demonstrate both the generosity of the sending kingdom and the prestige of the receiving one. The arrival of a Mitanni princess with her retinue of 317 attendants, announced to the world through Amenhotep's commemorative scarab, was not merely a marriage, it was a spectacle, a public demonstration of the Egyptian-Mitanni alliance that was designed to impress the other great powers and to remind the vassal states that the Pharaoh's network of alliances was vast, powerful, and enduring. The Amarna letters, 382 cuneiform tablets discovered in 1887 at the site of Akhenaten's abandoned capital at Tel El Amarna, provide the most detailed picture of international diplomacy in the ancient world. The letters were written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca, the shared language of official international communication of the Late Bronze Age, equivalent to the Latin of medieval Europe or the English of the modern world, and they record the correspondence between the Egyptian court and the kings of Babylon, Mitanni, Assyria, Hatti, Arzawa, Al-Ashiyar, and dozens of smaller states. The bulk of the correspondence dates to the reigns of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, and the letters that pertain to Amenhotep's reign reveal a diplomat of extraordinary skill, patience, and psychological acuity, a ruler who managed his complex, demanding, and politically sensitive foreign relationships not through military force or implied threat but through the careful, sustained, personally engaged cultivation of ties that were simultaneously political, economic, and personal. A ruler who managed his international relationships with a sophistication, a subtlety, and a shrewdness that his military predecessors had never attempted. The relationship with Mitanni was the centerpiece of the diplomatic system. The peace between Egypt and Mitanni, which had been established by Thutmose IV and which Amenhotep II had initiated, was deepened and formalized under Amenhotep III through a series of royal marriages that bound the two dynasties together in a web of familial connections. Amenhotep married at least two, and possibly more, Mitanni princesses, Gilukepa and Tadukepa, daughters of the Mitanni kings Shatana II and Tushrata respectively, incorporating them into his royal harem and using their presence at his court as a symbol of the alliance between the two powers. The marriages were celebrated with the exchange of lavish gifts. The Amarna letters record, in extraordinary detail, the dowries, the bride prices, and the diplomatic presents that accompanied each marriage, including gold, silver, precious stones, chariots, horses, textiles, furniture, and luxury goods of every description. The scale of the gift exchanges was extraordinary. The bride prices and dowries recorded in the Amarna letters represent some of the largest transfers of wealth documented in the ancient world, and they demonstrate the enormous economic investment that the great powers made in the maintenance of their diplomatic relationships. The marriages were not merely symbolic, they were economic transactions of enormous value, political alliances of the highest significance, and personal relationships that bound the royal families of the great powers together in a web of kinship that made warfare between them not merely undesirable, but, in some sense, fratricidal. The marriage to the Mitanni princess Gilukhepa was celebrated with particular fanfare and diplomatic significance. Amenhotep issued a commemorative scarab announcing the arrival of the Mitanni princess and her retinue of 317 attendants, a specific and impressively large number that gives some indication of the extraordinary scale, the logistical complexity, and the grandeur of the diplomatic marriages that characterized the era. The Gilukhepa scarab, one of at least 5 series of commemorative scarabs that Amenhotep issued during his reign, each celebrating a different aspect of his royal achievements during his reign, is itself a fascinating document of the pharaoh's deliberate and innovative approach to public communication, and not approach that was, in many respects, more sophisticated than that of any previous pharaoh, and that anticipated, by 34 centuries, the modern concept of public relations. Unlike the military inscriptions of his predecessors, which celebrated victories and conquests, Amenhotep's commemorative scarabs celebrated marriages, royal hunting expeditions, the construction of pleasure lakes, and monumental building projects, peaceful achievements that reflected the pharaoh's priorities and that announced to the world that the Egyptian empire under Amenhotep III was powerful enough to define its own terms of greatness. The commemorative scarabs are themselves a remarkable innovation in pharaonic communication. Amenhotep issued at least 5 series of scarabs during his reign, celebrating his marriage to Ti, his first lion hunt, the arrival of the Mitanni princess Gilukhepa, the excavation of a pleasure lake for Queen Ti, and a wild bull hunt. The scarabs were mass-produced. Hundreds, possibly thousands of copies of each type were made and distributed across the empire and beyond, making them one of the earliest known examples of state propaganda aimed at a mass audience, a technology of communication that anticipated the broadsheets, the pamphlets, and the press releases of later civilizations by millennia. The artistic innovation of Amenhotep's reign extended beyond the monumental to the personal. The jewelry, the glasswork, the faience, and the decorative objects produced during the Golden Age represent some of the highest achievements of Egyptian craftsmanship. The glass-making technology of the Amenhotep III period was among the most advanced in the ancient world, producing vessels and decorative objects of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication that demonstrate a mastery of the material that would not be surpassed until the Roman period, more than a millennium later. The cobalt blue glass that the Egyptian workshops produced was particularly prized, traded across the ancient world as a luxury commodity that served, like the gold, as both a demonstration of Egyptian technical mastery and a diplomatic gift that reinforced the pharaoh's international relationships. The small objects, the cosmetic vessels, the jewelry, the amulets, the decorative tiles, are in some ways more revealing than the colossal monuments, because they show the Golden Age at the intimate scale of daily life, demonstrating that the magnificence of Amenhotep's reign extended not merely to the temples and the palaces, but to the personal possessions of the men and women who lived in the pharaoh's court and who experienced the Golden Age at the level of texture, color, and craftsmanship. The content of the scarabs is as revealing as their distribution. The lion hunt scarab records that Amenhotep killed 102 lions during the first 10 years of his reign, a number that is specific enough and unusual enough to suggest genuine and meticulous record-keeping, and that demonstrates the pharaoh's personal courage and hunting skill. The wild bull hunt scarab describes a single day's hunt in which the pharaoh killed 56 wild bulls, another feat of personal physical prowess that connects Amenhotep to the athletic tradition of his grandfather Amenhotep II, while surpassing it in the scale and the drama of the achievement. The Pleasure Lake scarab records that the pharaoh ordered the excavation of an artificial lake for Queen Tai, an enormous body of water measuring approximately 3,700 cubits long by 700 cubits wide, a recreational lake of extraordinary proportions, and that the lake was completed in the remarkably short period of just 15 days, a feat of hydraulic engineering and labor mobilization that testifies to the extraordinary administrative capacity of the Egyptian state under Amenhotep. The Pleasure Lake scarab is particularly revealing because it celebrates an act of personal devotion, the pharaoh building a recreational facility for his queen, rather than an act of state policy or religious obligation. The celebration of a private gift on a public monument was unprecedented in the pharaonic tradition, and suggests a relationship between Amenhotep and Ti that was not merely political but genuinely affectionate, a partnership that was sustained by personal attachment, as well as by the calculations of power and succession that governed all royal marriages in the ancient world, a claim that testifies to the truly enormous labor force at the pharaoh's immediate command and disposal, and to the administrative efficiency with which it was deployed. The gold was the key. Egypt had more gold than any other kingdom in the Near East, a fact that the Amarna letters make clear in sometimes comical terms. The Babylonian king Kadashman-Enlil wrote to Amenhotep complaining that the gold the pharaoh had sent was insufficient, that when his craftsmen had melted down the gold vessels Amenhotep had sent as diplomatic gifts, the actual gold content was far less than the vessel's appearance suggested. The complaint reveals both the importance of gold in the diplomatic exchange system and the pharaoh's willingness to, perhaps, exaggerate the generosity of his gifts. Another Babylonian king wrote that in Egypt, gold was as common as dirt, a phrase that, even allowing for the considerable element of diplomatic flattery, suggests the extraordinary scale of Egyptian wealth during Amenhotep's reign. The gold came primarily from the mines of Nubia, the Egyptian-controlled territory to the south that produced more gold than any other region in the ancient world, and Amenhotep used it as the primary instrument of his foreign policy, the lubricant that kept the diplomatic machinery running, the currency that purchased alliance, the gift that demonstrated generosity, and the bribe that ensured compliance, purchasing loyalty, rewarding allies, and subsidizing the diplomatic relationships that sustained the international peace. The relationship with Babylon was managed with equal care and with an attention to the personal sensitivities of the Babylonian kings that reveals Amenhotep as a diplomat of genuine psychological insight. The Babylonian rulers, like most of the great kings of the Near East, wanted two things from the Egyptian pharaoh: gold and royal marriages. They wanted Egyptian princesses for their harems, and they wanted Egyptian gold for their treasuries. Amenhotep provided the gold generously, but steadfastly refused to send Egyptian princesses to Babylon, maintaining the long-standing and theologically grounded Egyptian policy that daughters of the pharaoh, as members of the divine royal family, as carriers of the sacred bloodline that connected the pharaonic dynasty to the gods themselves, were not to be given in marriage to foreign kings, regardless of those kings' wealth, power, or diplomatic importance. The refusal was diplomatic rather than personal. It reflected the Egyptian theological position that the pharaoh's daughters, as members of the divine royal family, could not be subordinated to a foreign ruler. But it required careful management, since the Babylonian kings repeatedly pressed the issue and occasionally expressed frustration at the pharaoh's unwillingness to reciprocate the marriages that they had offered. The correspondence between Amenhotep and the Babylonian king Kadashman-Enlil is one of the most revealing diplomatic exchanges in the Amarna archive, a conversation between two rulers who respected each other's power but who disagreed, sometimes sharply, about the terms of their relationship. In one letter, Kadashman-Enlil suggests that Amenhotep could simply send a beautiful Egyptian woman and claim she was a princess. Who would say that she is not a king's daughter? A suggestion that reveals both the Babylonian king's frustration, and his pragmatic willingness to accept the form of reciprocity, even if the substance was lacking. Amenhotep's response, preserved only in fragmentary form, apparently rejected the suggestion, maintaining the Egyptian position with the diplomatic firmness that characterized all of his international dealings. The diplomatic correspondence also reveals the more personal dimensions of Amenhotep's character: his wit, his stubbornness, his occasional pettiness, and his profound understanding of the psychology of power. The letters show a pharaoh who was not merely executing a diplomatic strategy, but personally engaged in the management of his international relationships, dictating letters, reviewing proposals, negotiating terms, and managing the expectations of rival kings with a hands-on, personally engaged involvement that suggests both genuine intellectual interest in and a natural aptitude for the art of diplomacy. The Amarna letters also shed light on one of the most practical and revealing aspects of Amenhotep's diplomatic strategy: his use of diplomatic marriages not merely as political alliances, but as intelligence-gathering operations. The foreign princesses who entered the pharaoh's harem brought with them not only their personal retinues, but also their knowledge of their home courts, the political dynamics, the military capabilities, the economic conditions, and the internal power struggles of the kingdoms they came from. The princesses served as informal ambassadors, sources of information about their home kingdoms that supplemented the formal diplomatic correspondence, and that gave the pharaoh a more intimate and more nuanced understanding of the international landscape than any amount of official communication could have provided. The harem was, in this sense, an intelligence service, a network of well-connected informants who provided the pharaoh with insider knowledge of the courts of every major power in the Near East. The health of the pharaoh during the later years of his reign is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. The physical remains of the pharaoh himself tell a story that the monuments cannot. The mummy of Amenhotep III, found in the KV-35 cache in the tomb of Amenhotep II, where it had been placed by the priests of the 21st Dynasty, shows evidence of significant dental disease, obesity, and other conditions that suggest the pharaoh suffered from declining health in his final years. Some scholars have suggested that the three said festivals, the extraordinary jubilees that Amenhotep celebrated in the 30th, 34th, and 37th years of his reign, were motivated in part by the pharaoh's deteriorating physical condition, an attempt to renew his divine power through the ritual mechanisms that the Egyptian theological system provided. The festivals may have been, in this interpretation, not merely celebrations of longevity, but therapeutic interventions, theological treatments for a physical decline that the conventional medical knowledge and pharmaceutical resources of the 14th century BC could not effectively address. But here is what makes this truly terrifying: not the diplomacy itself, but what the diplomacy reveals about the fragility of the system that sustained it. The Late Bronze Age international system, the club of great powers, the network of alliances and exchanges that maintained peace across the Near East for more than a century, was entirely dependent on the continued stability and wealth of its member states. The system had no external enforcement mechanism, no international court, no collective security arrangement, no institution that could compel compliance or punish defection. It was held together by self-interest, by habit, by the personal relationships between individual rulers, and by the flow of gold and goods that made the maintenance of the system profitable for all its participants. When any of these elements failed, when a king died and was replaced by a successor who was less committed to the system, when a kingdom's wealth declined and it could no longer sustain the flow of gifts, when an external threat disrupted the trade routes that connected the member states, the system was vulnerable to collapse. And collapse it did, catastrophically, comprehensively, and almost overnight, in the century following Amenhotep's death, when the Sea Peoples, the Hittite-Egyptian Wars, and the general disruption of the Late Bronze Age brought the entire international system crashing down. The comparison with Amenhotep's role in sustaining the system during its peak years makes the subsequent collapse all the more devastating. Amenhotep managed the system with consummate skill, balancing the competing demands of multiple great powers, managing the expectations of vassal rulers, maintaining the flow of gold that lubricated the diplomatic machinery, and projecting the image of Egyptian wealth and power that made the other members of the club willing to accept Egyptian leadership. He was the most skilled operator in a system that required extraordinary skill to operate, and the fact that the system collapsed within a century of his death suggests that the system itself was less robust than it appeared, that its stability was dependent on the personal qualities of the rulers who managed it, and that the magnificent edifice of international cooperation and mutual benefit that Amenhotep had so carefully and so skillfully constructed was, in its fundamental nature, far more fragile, far more dependent on individual leadership, and far more vulnerable to disruption than its splendid and apparently permanent surface suggested. The role of Queen Ti in the diplomatic system deserves special attention, because her involvement in international affairs was, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinary. The Amarna letters contained correspondence addressed specifically to Ta by foreign kings, rulers who recognized her as a figure of genuine political authority and who sought her intervention in disputes that the pharaoh himself had not resolved. After Amenhotep's death, the Mitanni king Tushratta wrote to Ta, asking her to ensure that the diplomatic relationship between Egypt and Mitanni would be maintained under the new pharaoh, a request that acknowledges Ta's continuing influence at the Egyptian court and her ability to shape the policies of her son's reign. The letter is remarkable, a foreign king appealing to a queen mother for the continuation of a diplomatic relationship that had been the cornerstone of his kingdom's security. It demonstrates both the extraordinary status that Ti had achieved during Amenhotep's reign and the degree to which the diplomatic system of the Late Bronze Age was built on personal relationships rather than institutional structures. Relationships that were vulnerable to disruption whenever the individuals who sustained them died or lost their influence. The Sed Festival, the Jubilee celebration that pharaohs traditionally held after 30 years on the throne, provides another window into the magnificence and the political calculation of Amenhotep's reign. Amenhotep celebrated 3 Sed festivals in the 30th, 34th, and 37th years of his reign, and each was an event of extraordinary scale and lavishness. The festivals were held at the Palace of Malkata, where the pharaoh's artificial harbour and ceremonial lake provided the setting for elaborate rituals, processions, feasting, and the distribution of gifts to the court, the priesthood, and the people. The said festival was, in theory, a renewal of the pharaoh's divine power, a ritual in which the king's physical and spiritual vitality was restored through ceremonial acts that symbolized his continued fitness to rule. In practice, it was a political event, a demonstration of the pharaoh's wealth, generosity, and authority that served to reinforce the loyalty of the court and to demonstrate to the domestic and international audience that the pharaoh remained vigorous, capable, and in control of the enormous resources of the Egyptian state. The said festival was also an economic event, an occasion for the distribution of wealth, the rewarding of loyal servants, and the demonstration of the pharaoh's generosity and divine benevolence toward the people of Egypt and toward the servants and officials who had dedicated their careers to the service of the crown. The festivals at Malkata involved the construction of temporary structures, pavilions, viewing stands, ceremonial platforms that were built specifically for the occasion and that demonstrate the extraordinary resources that Amenhotep was willing to invest in a single event. The archaeological evidence from the Malkata site includes thousands of fragments of decorated pottery, wine jars labelled with dates and vintages that allow scholars to reconstruct the scale and the chronology of the celebrations with remarkable precision. The festivals were also occasions for artistic production, the creation of new sculptures, new inscriptions, and new decorative programs that commemorated the pharaoh's renewal and that contributed to the extraordinary artistic legacy of the reign. Some of the finest surviving works of Amenhotep III's reign including the magnificent seated statue now in the British Museum, were produced in connection with the said festivals and bear inscriptions that connect them specifically to the pharaoh's Jubilee celebrations. The three said festivals of Amenhotep III are significant not merely for their scale, but for what they reveal about the pharaoh's self-conception. Most pharaohs celebrated at most one said festival, the 30-year jubilee that the tradition prescribed. Some celebrated two. Amenhotep celebrated three. An extraordinary and unprecedented act of theological confidence that asserted his divine status with a boldness that surpassed anything his predecessors had attempted. The festivals were not merely celebrations of longevity, they were declarations of divinity, public rituals in which the pharaoh presented himself not merely as the representative of the gods on earth but as a god himself, a living deity whose power was self-sustaining and whose authority was not delegated but intrinsic. This is not science fiction. This is the documented, archaeologically attested, inscriptionally recorded reality of a pharaoh who was, during his own lifetime and with his own active encouragement, worshipped as a living god, a living deity whose cult was maintained in temples across Egypt and Nubia, whose statues were objects of devotion and prayer, and whose divine status was not merely a polite fiction maintained by the court, but a genuine theological claim that the pharaoh himself appears to have believed and that the Egyptian people accepted. The deification of the living pharaoh was not new. The pharaonic theology had always included an element of divine kingship. But Amenhotep took it further than any previous ruler, actively promoting his own cult and building temples in which he himself was the primary object of worship. The most striking example is the temple at Soleb in Nubia, where Amenhotep III is depicted worshipping an image of himself. The living pharaoh offering prayers to the deified pharaoh, the human king venerating the divine king, the mortal aging, physically declining self-offering prayers and devotions to the immortal, eternally youthful, divinely perfect self, in a theological loop that collapses the distinction between the worshipper and the worshipped, and that represents, in its boldest and most radical form, the theological claim that the pharaoh was not merely the representative of the gods on earth, but was himself a god, fully, completely, and without qualification. The self-deification of Amenhotep III was not merely a personal vanity or a political strategy. It was a theological innovation with consequences that extended far beyond the pharaoh's own reign. By asserting his own divinity in such explicit and unambiguous terms, by building temples to himself, by depicting himself worshipping himself, by promoting his own cult alongside the cults of the traditional deities, Amenhotep was pushing the boundaries of Egyptian theology in a direction that had never been explored so aggressively. The pharaoh had always been considered divine, but the divinity had traditionally been understood as a quality that attached to the office rather than to the person, a sacred attribute that the pharaoh acquired through coronation and that he passed on to his successor at death. Amenhotep's innovation was to claim divinity not merely as a function of his office, but as a quality of his person. To assert that he was a god not because he occupied the throne, but because he was Amenhotep, because the divine power flowed through his particular body with a directness and an intensity that exceeded what any previous pharaoh had claimed. The innovation was significant, and it had consequences that Amenhotep could not have foreseen. By asserting his own personal divinity so aggressively, Amenhotep created a precedent that his son Akhenaten would take to its logical extreme. The claim that the pharaoh was not merely a god among gods, but the sole intermediary between humanity and the divine, the only channel through which the power of the Aten reached the human world. Akhenaten's monotheism, his insistence that the Aten was the only true god and that the pharaoh was the Aten's only prophet, was, in a sense, the logical conclusion of the theological trajectory that Amenhotep III had initiated. The father's self-deification made the son's monopolization of divine access possible. The Golden Age's theological innovation became the crisis's theological foundation. And now we arrive at the question that has been building throughout this long night. The question that the colossi of Memnon pose to every visitor who stands before them and looks past the two colossal figures to the empty fields behind, where the greatest temple in the history of ancient Egypt once stood, and where nothing now remains but the rubble and the silence and the slow, patient, relentless work of the Nile, which has been dissolving the monuments of the pharaohs since the day they were built. What does it mean for a civilization to peak? The reign of Amenhotep III was, by every measurable criterion, wealth, artistic achievement, diplomatic sophistication, architectural ambition, cultural refinement, the peak of ancient Egyptian civilization, the moment when the trajectory that had begun with the wars of liberation against the Hyksos, that had continued through the campaigns of Thutmose III and the consolidation of the empire under his successors, reached its highest point and began, imperceptibly at first, and then with gathering momentum, to curve back toward the earth. Egypt was richer under Amenhotep than it had been under any previous pharaoh. The temples were more magnificent, the palaces were more luxurious, the art was more sophisticated, the diplomacy was more skilled and more personally engaged than that of any previous reign. The international position was more secure. Everything that the 18th Dynasty had been building toward, everything that Thutmose III had conquered, and Amenhotep II had defended, and Thutmose IV had consolidated, reached its fullest expression under the 9th pharaoh of the dynasty, the man who sat on the quartzite throne between the colossi and looked out over a world that was, by any reasonable assessment, the most magnificent the ancient world had ever produced. Let that sink in. The peak of Egyptian civilization was not the age of the pyramids. It was not the reign of Ramesses the Great. It was the reign of a pharaoh whom most people have never heard of, a man whose name is familiar to Egyptologists and to visitors to Luxor, but who does not occupy, in the popular imagination, the place that his achievements deserve. Amenhotep III presided over the wealthiest, the most artistically accomplished, and the most diplomatically sophisticated era in the 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt. And he is remembered, when he is remembered at all, as the father of Akhenaten and the grandfather of Tutankhamun. The peak is defined by the valley that followed it. The Golden Age is overshadowed by the crisis that came next. And this is the deeper truth. The truth that the colossi of Memnon silently proclaim to every visitor who stands before them and wonders what lies beneath the empty fields behind. Peaks are followed by declines. Golden ages are followed by dark ages. The magnificence of a civilization at its zenith is, in retrospect, also the signal of its impending transformation, because the very conditions that produce magnificence, the wealth, the stability, the freedom from external threat, are also the very conditions that produce the complacency, the overconfidence, the excess, and the theological experimentation that undermine the foundations on which the magnificence was built. Amenhotep III's reign created the conditions for Akhenaten's revolution. The wealth that Amenhotep accumulated funded the building programs and the artistic experiments of his son's reign. The theological innovations that Amenhotep pioneered, the promotion of the Aten, the solar disc, as an increasingly important deity in the Egyptian pantheon, the deification of the living pharaoh as a god in his own right, provided the intellectual foundation for Akhenaten's radical monotheism. The diplomatic security that Amenhotep established, the peace with Mitanni, the alliance with Babylon, the stability of the vassal system, gave Akhenaten the freedom to turn his attention inward, to focus on religious reform rather than military defense, to neglect the empire's external relationships in pursuit of an internal theological revolution that would have been impossible under a pharaoh who needed to devote his energy to military affairs. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the relationship between greatness and stability, and the reign of Amenhotep III is the evidence. We assume that the peak of a civilization is also the moment of its greatest security, that the wealth, the power, and the cultural achievement that define a golden age also guarantee its continuation. The historical evidence, as the Colossi of Memnon silently attest, suggests otherwise. The peak is the moment of greatest vulnerability, because it is the moment when the civilization's resources are most fully committed, when its attention is most fully absorbed by the maintenance of its own magnificence, and when the conditions for destabilizing change are most fully developed. The Golden Age carries within itself the seeds of the crisis that will follow not because the Golden Age causes the crisis, but because the same conditions that produced the one also produced the other. The wealth that funded Amenhotep's building program also funded Akhenaten's revolution. The theological experimentation that Amenhotep encouraged also created the intellectual climate, the atmosphere of theological speculation, of religious experimentation, of questioning and innovation, in which Akhenaten's radical monotheism could take root and flourish. Amenhotep III had promoted the cult of the Aten, the solar disk, with increasing emphasis during the later years of his reign. The Aten was not a new deity. The concept of the sun disk as a manifestation of divine power had existed in Egyptian theology for centuries. But Amenhotep elevated the Aten's status within the Egyptian pantheon, building temples to the Aten, incorporating the Aten into his royal titulary, and naming his pleasure barge, the Aten Gleams, and his palace complex at Malkata, the house of Nebmatra, as the Aten's splendor. Names that placed the solar disk at the center of the pharaoh's personal world in ways that suggested a special devotion to this particular aspect of the solar deity. The promotion of the Aten under Amenhotep was not a revolution. It was a gradual, incremental, theologically conservative process that remained within the bounds of traditional Egyptian polytheism, but it created a precedent, a theological opening, that Akhenaten would exploit to its most radical and most destructive conclusion. The diplomatic peace that Amenhotep maintained also created the complacency that allowed Akhenaten to neglect the empire's external relationships. The peak and the crisis are not opposites. They are aspects of the same phenomenon, different expressions, different manifestations, different consequences of the same underlying historical dynamic, different consequences of the same historical conditions. Consequences that no individual ruler, however wise, however skilled, however far-sighted, can fully anticipate or fully control. The specific mechanism by which the Golden Age produced the crisis is worth examining in detail, because it illuminates a pattern that recurs throughout the history of civilizations. The wealth that Amenhotep accumulated gave the Egyptian state an unprecedented surplus, resources that exceeded what was needed for the maintenance of the existing system, and that were available, therefore, for investment in new projects, new experiments, and new ideas. Under Amenhotep, these surplus resources were directed toward building, art, and diplomacy, purposes that enriched the civilization without challenging its foundations. Under Akhenaten, the same surplus was directed toward religious revolution, a project that challenged the foundations of the civilization in the most fundamental way possible by attacking the theological system that justified the pharaoh's authority, that organized the Egyptian priesthood, that structured the Egyptian economy, and that gave meaning to the lives of millions of ordinary Egyptians. The surplus was the same, the use of the surplus was different, and the difference between a golden age and a crisis, was a matter of individual choice, individual vision, and individual temperament, applied to resources that the previous generation had accumulated and that the current generation was free to deploy as it saw fit. The implications for our understanding of historical causation are profound. The Golden Age did not cause the crisis in the mechanical sense. Amenhotep III did not set in motion a chain of events that inevitably produced Akhenaten's revolution. But the Golden Age created the conditions, the extraordinary wealth, the unprecedented stability, the remarkable freedom from external threat, the enormous surplus of resources and administrative attention, the atmosphere of theological experimentation that made the crisis possible. Without the Golden Age, Akhenaten would not have had the resources to fund his revolution. Without the peace that Amenhotep maintained, Akhenaten would not have had the freedom to neglect the empire's external relationships. Without the theological innovations that Amenhotep encouraged, the promotion of the Aten, the deification of the living pharaoh, Akhenaten would not have had the intellectual foundation on which to build his radical monotheism. The trajectory from father to son, from Amenhotep's cautious, conservative promotion of the Aten within the existing polytheistic framework to Akhenaten's radical, revolutionary rejection of every other deity in favor of the Aten alone, is one of the most dramatic intellectual transitions in the history of religion. The distance between the two positions, between the Father's inclusive polytheism and the Son's exclusive monotheism, is enormous. But the distance was travelled in a single generation, fueled by the wealth that the Father had accumulated, enabled by the peace that the Father had maintained, and inspired by the theological innovations that the Father had encouraged. The revolution did not come from outside the system. It came from within, from the very heart of the Golden Age, from the court of the most magnificent Pharaoh who had ever lived, from the son who was raised in the lap of luxury, and who used his father's resources to destroy his father's world. Let that sink in. The greatest Pharaoh in Egyptian history, the Pharaoh who built the most, who spent the most, who created the most magnificent civilization the ancient world had ever seen, also created the conditions for the most devastating, the most disruptive, and the most historically consequential crisis that the 18th Dynasty, and perhaps the entire 3,000-year span of the pharaonic system, would ever experience. The Father's extraordinary success was the Son's extraordinary opportunity, and the Son used that opportunity not to build further on the Father's achievement, but to tear down the entire theological, institutional, and artistic framework that the Father had brought to its highest expression. The irony is absolute, the tragedy is complete, and the colossi of Memnon, the last witnesses to the Father's magnificence, sit in their fields and stare at the empty horizon and say nothing. They have been saying nothing for 3,400 years, watching the river rise and fall, watching the seasons turn, watching the civilizations that succeeded Egypt. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans, the Europeans, come and go with the same patient indifference that the stone has shown to everything that has happened in its presence since the day it was carved. They will say nothing for 3,400 more. The silence is their testimony. The eloquent, devastating, historically irrefutable testimony of stone that has outlasted everything it was meant to protect, and that stands, today, as the purest possible expression of the relationship between magnificence and impermanence, between the ambition to last forever and the reality that nothing does. The grief that the colossi inspire, and it is grief, genuine grief, the kind that tightens the chest and silences the mind, is the grief of recognition. We see in the colossi our own monuments. We see in the empty fields our own future. We see in the dissolution of the greatest temple in the history of ancient Egypt the shadow of a possibility that haunts every civilization that has ever built something it believed would last. The possibility that the building will not last, that the beauty will not endure, that the magnificence that we have built will dissolve, as all magnificence eventually dissolves, as the Nile dissolved Amenhotep's temple, into the slow, patient, inexorable, and ultimately irresistible work of time, the one adversary that even the gods cannot defeat. We have followed Amenhotep III from his birth as the son of a minor pharaoh to his death, as the most magnificent ruler in the history of ancient Egypt. We have seen the building program, the largest in Egyptian history, the most ambitious in the ancient world. We have seen the diplomacy, the Amarna letters, the marriage alliances, the rivers of gold that flowed from the deep and seemingly inexhaustible mines of Nubia to the treasuries of Babylon and Mitanni and the Hittite court. We have seen the palace at Malkata, the painted walls, the lily columns, the artificial harbour, the pleasure barge that sailed on the ceremonial lake. We have seen the Sed festivals, the 3 jubilees that proclaimed the pharaoh's divinity with a confidence that no previous ruler had matched. And we have seen the paradox, the inescapable, devastating, historically confirmed paradox that the peak of Egyptian civilization was also the preparation for its most destructive crisis. What does this story mean for us? Not for Egyptologists, not for historians, but for anyone who has ever witnessed a golden age and wondered how long it would last. It means that magnificence is not permanence. The most magnificent buildings are not necessarily the most durable, a lesson that the colossi of Memnon teach with the eloquent silence of 18-meter-tall quartzite statues sitting in the middle of an agricultural field guarding a temple that no longer exists. Amenhotep's mortuary temple was the largest in the history of Egypt, and it was destroyed, not by an enemy army but by the Nile itself, the same river that sustained the civilization that built the temple, the same river that provided the water, the silt, and the agricultural abundance that made the wealth possible, the same river whose annual floods, predictable in their timing, essential in their fertilizing function, and ultimately uncontrollable in their destructive power, were the foundation of everything Egypt was, and everything Egypt achieved. The river was both creator and destroyer. The force that made the civilization possible was also the force that dissolved its greatest monument. The lesson could not be more clear or more disturbing. The river that gave life also took it back. The force that sustained the magnificence also dissolved it. It means that peace is not passive. Amenhotep III did not merely inherit peace, he actively maintained it through decades of skilled diplomacy, careful management of international relationships, and the strategic deployment of wealth and cultural prestige. Peace is a product. It must be manufactured, maintained, and defended, and the instruments of its defense are not merely military, but diplomatic, economic, and cultural. Amenhotep understood this instinctively, and his reign demonstrates that the maintenance of peace requires as much skill, as much energy, and as much political intelligence as the prosecution of war. The pharaoh who never fought a battle was not a passive ruler. He was one of the most active, most engaged, and most politically sophisticated rulers in the history of the ancient world, a man who governed not through force, but through the far more demanding and far more effective instrument of calculated magnificence. And it means that every golden age carries within itself the conditions for the transformation that will follow. The wealth that funds the golden age also funds the experiments, the artistic innovations, the theological speculations, the cultural departures that will eventually challenge the foundations on which the golden age was built. The peace that sustains the golden age also creates the leisure and the freedom that allow the radical thinkers, the innovators, and the revolutionaries to develop their ideas. The stability that characterizes the golden age also produces the complacency, the assumption that the current order is permanent, that the existing institutions are indestructible, that the magnificence will last forever, that makes the golden age vulnerable to the very forces it has inadvertently created. Amenhotep III could not have foreseen what his son would do. He could not have anticipated that the wealth he accumulated would fund a religious revolution, that the innovative theological experiments he actively encouraged and promoted would produce a pharaoh who rejected the entire pantheon in favor of a single god, that the diplomatic peace he maintained would be neglected by a successor who was too absorbed in theological speculation to attend to the empire's external relationships. The father built the golden age, the son tore it down, and the irony, the deep, structural, historically inevitable irony, is that the son could not have torn it down without the foundation that the father had laid. The pattern is not unique to Egypt. Every civilization that has experienced a golden age has also experienced the crisis that followed. The moment when the conditions that produced the magnificence also produced the forces that challenged it, the experiments that disrupted it, and the revolutions that transformed it. The golden age of Periclean Athens produced the philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, whose ideas challenged the assumptions on which Athenian democracy was built. The golden age of the Roman Antonines produced the conditions, the wealth, the complacency, the military overextension that made the crisis of the 3rd century possible. The golden age of the Islamic Caliphate produced the intellectual freedom that encouraged the scientific and philosophical innovations that would, centuries later, transform the civilization that had made them possible. In every case, the golden age produced its own challengers, not because the golden age was flawed, but because the conditions that make a golden age possible are the same conditions that make transformation. Sometimes gradual, sometimes violent, sometimes productive, sometimes destructive, not merely possible, but, in some deep and structural sense, inevitable. The reign of Amenhotep III stands as a permanent reminder that the peak is also the precipice, that the moment of greatest achievement is also the moment of greatest risk, that the conditions that produce magnificence are also the conditions that produce vulnerability, and that the civilization that reaches its highest expression under one ruler may, under the very next ruler, begin the descent that will eventually carry it away from the heights it had reached and into the valleys that lie below. The reminder is not comforting. It is not meant to be. It is the truth that the colossi of Memnon have been telling for 34 centuries. The truth that the stone has always known, that the river has always known, that the desert has always known, and that the living in every generation must learn anew at the cost of their own monuments and their own certainties. The Athenian Golden Age of Pericles was followed by the devastating Peloponnesian War that consumed Greek civilization for a generation. The Roman Golden Age of the Antonines was followed by the devastating military, economic, and political crisis of the 3rd century that nearly destroyed the Roman state. The Islamic Golden Age of the Abbasid caliphs was followed by the Mongol invasions that destroyed Baghdad and shattered the intellectual and political framework of the Islamic world. The pattern is not merely observable, it is practically universal across civilizations and across centuries, and it raises the most unsettling question that the study of the past can pose. If every golden age carries within itself the seeds of its own transformation, then what does that mean for us? What does that mean for a world that has achieved levels of wealth, technology, and interconnection that Amenhotep III could not have imagined, and that may, for precisely that reason, be more vulnerable than any previous civilization to the forces of disruption, the experiments in governance, and the challenges to established institutions that golden ages inevitably produce? The question is not rhetorical, it is urgent. The parallels between the Late Bronze Age international system, the club of great powers that Amenhotep managed with such consummate skill, and the modern international order are uncomfortable and illuminating. Both systems are built on the principle of mutual recognition among great powers. Both systems are sustained by trade, by diplomatic exchange, and by the shared interest in maintaining a status quo that benefits all participants. Both systems lack an external enforcement mechanism. There is no authority above the great powers that can compel compliance or punish defection, and both systems are vulnerable to the same kinds of disruption. The death of a key leader, the decline of a member state's economic power, the emergence of an external threat that the existing system cannot accommodate, or the internal transformation of a member state that changes its relationship to the system as a whole. The Late Bronze Age system collapsed. The question that Amenhotep's reign poses, the question that the colossi of Memnon silently ask every visitor who stands before them, is whether the modern system is more resilient than its ancient predecessor. The evidence of the past, the evidence of the colossi of Memnon sitting in their field, guarding a temple that no longer exists, is not reassuring. It suggests that the systems we build, however sophisticated, however well managed, however apparently permanent, are ultimately dependent on the continued commitment, the continued competence, and the continued good fortune of the individuals who operate them, and that when those individuals are replaced by successors who have different priorities, different visions, or different levels of competence, the systems they inherit can collapse with a speed and a completeness that astonishes everyone, including the people who are living through the collapse. The relationship between Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, the father who built the Golden Age and the son who demolished it, is one of the most instructive examples of intergenerational succession, failure in the history of human governance. The father was a builder, a man who profoundly understood the existing system, who genuinely valued its traditions and its achievements, and who used his extraordinary resources to bring the system to its highest expression. The son was a revolutionary, a man who rejected the existing system, who despised its traditions, and who used the same extraordinary resources that his father had accumulated to tear the system down and replace it with something new. The contrast between father and son, between the builder and the revolutionary, between the guardian of tradition and the destroyer of tradition, is as stark as any contrast in the history of the pharaonic system, and it raises the question that every civilization, every dynasty, every political system must eventually confront. The question that Amenhotep III faced, though he did not know it, in the final years of his reign. How do you protect the achievements of one generation from the experiments of the next? The answer, as the reign of Amenhotep III demonstrates with devastating clarity, is that you cannot. The same freedom that allows a great ruler to build also allows a lesser ruler, or a different kind of ruler, to destroy. The wealth that funds the Golden Age also funds the revolution. The stability that sustains the magnificence also creates the conditions for the upheaval that follows. The father builds, the son tears down, and the civilization that produced both. The civilization that was capable of the magnificence and vulnerable to the destruction endures the consequences of both, carrying the scars of the revolution alongside the remnants of the Golden Age, the fragments of beauty and achievement that survive the destruction and that testify across the centuries to what was possible before the crisis arrived. The reign of Amenhotep III also raises questions about the nature of historical memory, about why we remember certain rulers and forget others, and about the biases that shape our understanding of the past. Amenhotep III is, by any objective measure, one of the most historically significant, the most consequential, and the most transformative pharaohs in the entire 3,000-year history of ancient Egypt. The ruler who presided over the civilization's peak, who built its most magnificent monuments, who managed its most sophisticated diplomatic relationships, and who created the conditions that would define its subsequent history for generations. And yet he is far less famous than his grandson Tutankhamun, a minor pharaoh whose reign was brief, whose achievements were modest, and whose significance in the history of ancient Egypt is negligible compared to that of his grandfather. The explanation, of course, is the tomb. The discovery of Tutankhamun's intact burial in 1922 captivated the modern world and made the boy king, a pharaoh who reigned for barely a decade, who accomplished nothing of historical significance, and whose only lasting contribution to Egyptian history was his death and the intact burial that preserved his funerary treasures, the most famous, the most commercially recognizable, and the most culturally ubiquitous pharaoh in the entire 3,000-year history of the Egyptian state, eclipsing the far more significant, far more consequential, and far more historically important achievements of his grandfather in the popular imagination. The irony is bitter. The pharaoh who built the Golden Age is forgotten, while the pharaoh whose only distinction is an intact tomb is immortal. The lesson is that historical fame is not a measure of historical significance, that the rulers we remember are not necessarily the rulers who mattered most, and that the biases of modern discovery can distort our understanding of the past as thoroughly as the biases of ancient propaganda. It is late. The colossi of Memnon are dark, two enormous shapes against the star-filled sky, their quartzite surfaces still warm from the day's sun, their faces turned eastward toward the river and the temples and the living city on the far bank. Behind them there is nothing but the flat, dark, featureless expanse of the agricultural fields where the greatest temple in the history of ancient Egypt once stood, and where the Nile, indifferent to monuments and pharaohs and the ambitions of men who believe themselves to be gods, has been depositing its silt for millennia. So here is the answer to the question we began with. What made the reign of Amenhotep III the golden age of ancient Egypt? It was not military conquest. Amenhotep conducted no significant military campaigns. It was not territorial expansion. The empire under Amenhotep was essentially the same size as the empire under his great-grandfather, Thutmose III. It was not innovation. Amenhotep did not invent new technologies, new administrative systems, or new military techniques. What made Amenhotep's reign the Golden Age was the combination, the unprecedented, unrepeated, historically unique combination of wealth, peace, diplomatic sophistication, and artistic vision that allowed a single ruler, over a reign of nearly 4 decades, to transform the accumulated resources of 3 generations of military conquest into a civilization of such extraordinary beauty and refinement that it remains, across the vast gulf of 3,400 years, the standard against which all other periods of Egyptian history are measured, the benchmark of what was possible the demonstration of what wealth and peace and vision could produce when they were combined in a single reign under a ruler who understood, with an instinct that bordered on genius, how to convert material resources into cultural and political capital. The artistic achievements of the reign deserve particular attention because they represent one of the most extraordinary, the most technically accomplished, and the most aesthetically refined flowerings of artistic production in the entire history of human civilization. A flowering that transformed every medium, every material, and every genre of artistic expression that the Egyptian tradition recognized. The sculpture of the Amenhotep III period is among the finest in the history of Egyptian art, characterized by a serene beauty, a technical perfection, and a refinement of detail that set it apart from the art of every other period. The colossal statues, the colossi of Memnon, the enormous seated figures at the entrance to Luxor Temple, the sphinx forms that lined the processional avenues, are impressive for their size, but the smaller works, the portrait heads, the figurines, the decorated vessels, are impressive for their quality. The faces of Amenhotep and Ea, as depicted in the sculpture of the period, are among the most recognizable in ancient Egyptian art. The pharaoh's broad face, with its distinctive almond-shaped eyes, and its expression of serene confidence, and the queen's strong features, with their suggestion of intelligence and determination, have become iconic representations of Egyptian royalty at its peak. The painting and decorative arts of the period were equally distinguished. The palace at Malkata, whose walls were decorated with scenes of wildlife rendered with a naturalistic attention to detail that anticipated the nature art of later civilizations by millennia, represents one of the high points of Egyptian painting. The furniture, the jewellery, the glass, the faience, and the carved ivory and the worked precious metals of the Amenhotep III period are among the finest examples of Egyptian decorative arts. Objects of such beauty and such technical sophistication that they continue to astonish scholars who study them in the museums where they now reside. The magnificence was not accidental. It was deliberate, the product of a political strategy that used beauty as a weapon, art as a tool of governance, and the overwhelming display of wealth as a substitute for the military force that earlier pharaohs had used to maintain the empire. The strategy was brilliant, it was effective, and it was, in the end, temporary, because the very conditions that made the magnificence possible also created the conditions for the crisis that followed, the crisis that Amenhotep's son would unleash, and that would transform, permanently and irreversibly, the civilization that the Golden Age had brought to its highest expression. The mortuary temple is gone. The palace at Malkata is ruins, low mounds of mud brick and fragments of painted plaster that archaeologists sift through with trowels and brushes, recovering, fragment by painstaking fragment, pieces of the lily columns, and the wildlife murals, and the geometric ceiling patterns that once made the palace the most beautiful building in the ancient world. The 720 Sekhmet statues are scattered across the museums of the world, stone goddesses with lion heads and human bodies, separated from the temple that once gave them meaning, and from the pharaoh who commissioned them in the belief that their divine protection would sustain his legacy for eternity. But the colossi remain, as they have remained through every catastrophe, every invasion, every transformation, and every dissolution that has befallen the civilization that built them. They have survived the Nile floods that dissolved the temple behind them. They have survived the earthquakes that cracked their surfaces and toppled their crowns. They have survived the Roman tourists who carved their names into the stone and the medieval quarrymen who considered breaking them up for building material. They have survived the Ptolemaic period, the Roman period, the Islamic period, and the modern period, 34 centuries of weather, neglect, casual vandalism, and the slow, relentless, patient work of time, which has never, in the history of the universe, lost a contest with stone. The colossi remain, stubbornly, magnificently, almost defiantly remain, because they were built to last, built of quartzite, a stone harder and more durable than the sandstone and limestone that most Egyptian monuments were made of, a stone that resists erosion, resists weathering, and resists the slow, patient, molecule by molecule dissolution that has consumed every other architectural and sculptural element of Amenhotep's mortuary temple. The choice of quartzite for the colossi, rather than the softer, more easily worked sandstone or limestone that most Egyptian monuments were carved from, was not accidental. It was deliberate, the same calculated, strategic, politically motivated deliberateness that characterized everything Amenhotep did. He wanted to last. He wanted his face, his name, his image to endure, beyond the temple, beyond the palace, beyond the empire, beyond the civilization that he had brought to its highest expression. And in this at least, he succeeded. The face of Amenhotep III looks out across the Nile. The same face, the same quartzite, the same measured, serene, imperially confident gaze that has been directed eastward since the day the statue was placed on its foundation more than 3,400 years ago. The face is serene, the broad flat features, softened by 34 centuries of weathering, but still recognizable, still human, still bearing the expression that the sculptor carved into the quartzite more than 3 millennia ago. The expression is calm, the expression of a man who believed himself to be a god, and who governed an empire whose wealth and whose beauty justified the belief. The eyes look toward the rising sun, toward the light, toward the east, toward the renewal that the Egyptian theology promised to every pharaoh who had fulfilled his divine mandate and who deserved, in the afterlife, the eternal continuation of the life he had lived on earth. The golden age is over, the temple is gone, the palace is ruins, the empire has fallen, the dynasty has ended. The civilization that Amenhotep brought to its peak has been buried beneath 34 centuries of history. Conquered by the Persians, conquered by the Greeks, conquered by the Romans, absorbed into the Islamic world, rediscovered by European scholars, and studied, piece by fragmentary piece, by the archaeologists who crawl through the rubble of the magnificence and try to reconstruct what was lost. But the face remains, the colossi remain, and the memory of the Golden Age, the age when Egypt was the richest, the most beautiful, and the most magnificent civilization on earth, the age when a single pharaoh's vision transformed an empire's accumulated wealth, the gold of Nubia, the timber of Lebanon, the copper of Sinai, the lapis lazuli of Afghanistan, into something that transcended mere wealth, and that achieved, however briefly, the condition of genuine artistic and cultural transcendence, the age when beauty was power and magnificence was strategy, and the greatest temple ever built rose from the west bank of the Nile, like a declaration that human beings could, if they were sufficiently gifted and sufficiently determined, build something that was, for a single moment in the long history of the species, worthy of the gods themselves, worthy of the divine power that the pharaoh believed flowed through his body, worthy of the cosmic order that the temples were built to sustain, worthy of the eternity that the mortuary temple was designed to ensure, that memory endures, stubbornly, persistently, and with a quiet defiance that the stone itself seems to share, not in the temple which is gone, not in the palace which is ruins, but in the stone, in the quartzite, in the two colossal, time-weathered, eternally patient and eternally silent faces that look east towards the river and the city and the sunrise and the future and the past and the silence of 3,400 years, and that say, with the quiet authority of stone and time, and the memory of a magnificence that the modern world can only partially reconstruct and can never fully recover. This was here, this happened, this was real, and for a single, fleeting, irreplaceable, never to be repeated, heartbreakingly beautiful moment in the history of the human species, it was enough. Enough to justify the quartzite, enough to justify the gold, enough to justify the ambition and the labor and the vision of a pharaoh who believed that beauty was the highest form of power, and that magnificence was the truest expression of the divine.